Good morning. It's Friday morning, and you know what that means. That means it's time to talk with the one and only Jerry Kuzmarov. He is the editor over at covertactionmagazine.com, one of my favorite sites online. Let's talk. Hello, everyone, and this is the place you need to go for info. Covertactionmagazine.com. Let's go to the main. So look at this, great stories, right? We got, well, not great, but you get the point. Stepan Bandera's sinister MI6 alliance exposed. Israel and U.S. resume genocide of Palestinians. U.S. targeting of Russia risks nuclear war. Trump gives the world the middle finger. All kinds of stuff. Illegal surveillance programs, you name it. They're if it's related to covert action and intelligence, foreign policy, covertactionmagazine.com is all over it. And by the way, they got archives. They got all various series of videos you can check out. So let's go. So we're with Jeremy Kuzmarov. He is the editor over at, and he's a writer over at covertactionmagazine.com. Started by Phil Agee. He's a former CIA analyst, right?
Yeah, I think he was a covert action operations officer.
That's right. That's right. He was involved in it.
Yeah, he was involved in the skullduggery, and that's why he couldn't stomach it after some time.
All right. Well, and Jeremy is our resident expert. He knows all things covert action. Let's start here, Jeremy. You know, a lot of people, me a little bit, but a lot of people like you have been working on the JFK stuff for years. And, you know, I had heard from people, including you, who know a lot about the JFK assassination, that most of the stuff is already out there. That there's enough out there. Have we gotten anything new? Have you, so far, it's only been a few days, gotten anything of note or of interest?
I think there is some things of interest in those documents. I haven't been able to review them exhaustively. I just looked at about 5 or 10 documents, but I've seen, if I have time over the weekend, the next week, I'll try and keep going through them, at least a few per day. But I have seen a few articles online that pointed to some interesting things. One is that Jackie Kennedy, although, yeah, we may have already known this, but there's some documents, I think, that show that Jackie Kennedy and John Connally, the Texas governor who was in the limo, that they didn't think the Warren Commission was fair-minded at all, or a real investigation. So, I mean, I think that's significant because they were, if we have documents corroborating that, since they were so closely involved in these events, and they knew what was going on, if they didn't think the Warren Commission was impartial, that is very significant, I believe. And also, I think there's some documents that just shed more light on that Lee Harvey Oswald was indeed a CIA asset. And this contradict the official story with that he was some kind of a Russian agent, who had defected to the Soviet Union, and that this was a Russian plot. I mean, that was the line that Lyndon Johnson put out. So, if Oswald was a CIA asset, that is very significant. Now, yeah, we already know a lot. I mean, in some ways, it points to the anti-intellectual culture in the media, because, I read an article. I read the New York Times every day, and they had a front page article yesterday. Documents make clear Oswald did it, and those paranoid conspiracy theorists. But I mean, it's just like complete anti-intellectualism, because there are dozens and dozens of books, a lot of them very, very well researched, that expose there clearly was a conspiracy. And in fact, the evidence indicate there's no possibility that Oswald could have been the killer, because there are two credible witnesses, including his boss and the manager at the Texas School Book Depository, saw him on the second floor less than 2 minutes after the assassination, calmly drinking a Coke. So that's impossible. If he was on the sixth floor, he couldn't have made it to the second floor, firstly, in that 2 minutes after just having assassinated a president, and somehow had time to purchase a Coke and be very calm. And also, there are people on the stairs, and they didn't see him fleeing down the stairs. So just that alone would indicate that Oswald was set up. And I can go into more evidence. And I'd like to say I didn't know that much on this topic because it's a bit daunting. I mean, there's a lot of books out there and a lot of time. I was assisted by a fellow named Robert Morrow, who's lives in Austin, Texas, and he's a historian, and I think he was head of the Republican Party in Austin, Texas, at one point. But he's a real expert on this topic, and he guided me to certain sources. So, I feel like I'm something of an expert now because of his guidance. But I mean, yeah, these documents only may reveal certain things, but you have to wade into that literature to find out the real story. And I think, yeah, it's already known. And one thing that's neglected, the role that Lyndon Johnson played in the Kennedy assassination is already quite well documented. And someone in Johnson's circle in the Texas oil milieu, and many were connected with the CIA, so it's interconnected. And Johnson was a big-time supporter of the CIA as a senator. So that connection between Johnson, his circle, including David H. Byrd, who owned the Texas School Book Depository, and he actually kept a replica after as a trophy. So they were proud of what they did. But this story of Lee Harvey Oswald had long been discredited. And yeah, I plan on writing an article with Morrow for the anniversary that will push for the exoneration, that Lee Harvey Oswald should be exonerated and his reputation cleared, because the evidence is overwhelming that he was set up as a patsy. He was a CIA asset, and that's why some of these documents are valuable and just corroborating, although there are already a lot of evidence for that before, but these documents just further confirm that Oswald was indeed a CIA asset, and that, yeah, they set him up ultimately.
Now, my also understanding, do you know much about what happened in New Orleans? There was a district attorney or something. His name might have been Garrison, I don't remember, but who actually who said there was a conspiracy, who started to charge people with a conspiracy, and that was slapped down.
Correct. Yeah, this is Jim Garrison. He was the hero in Oliver Stone's movie, JFK. And yeah, I think his historical reputation will be restored with the release of these documents and growing consciousness that there was indeed a conspiracy. And hopefully this is awakening more and more people as to how the CIA uses that term conspiracy theorist as a weapon to silence dissent. Because we have a memo that came to light where the CIA actually established a blueprint where they instructed their media assets to call Jim Garrison and others of that era who saw something was wrong and were investigating and starting to see some of the deeper intrigue behind the conspiracy. And this memo instructed the CIA's media assets to call them conspiracy theorists and to denigrate them. And Garrison is still often denigrated in the mainstream. And one of his major detractors was a journalist named Hugh Ainsworth, who recently passed away. But he's been exposed. Actually, Morrow helped to expose him as a CIA operator. So the invective hurled at Garrison was driven by the CIA to discredit his investigations. And I don't think Garrison knew the whole story, but he was somebody who was seeking out the truth. and using his position as New Orleans district attorney to investigate and begin prosecution, because he did prosecute Clay Shaw.
No,
Now,
for the people who don't know, give us the story about what happened with Jim Garrison, what he did, what he found, and the
yeah,
whole the
well,
prosecution.
and New Orleans is significant because Lee Harvey Oswald worked in New Orleans in the summer before the JFK assassination, and he worked with this guy Bannister, who was an FBI, an extreme right winger with the John Birch Society and FBI. And now the cover was that Lee Harvey Oswald was part of the Fair Play for Cuba committee. You see, what the CIA does is they'll create a legend. And if you follow the pattern, they've done this with other patsies, including Timothy McVeigh, which we can discuss maybe next month, because I studied the Oklahoma City bombing. Uh, and I've seen this modus operandi, including with McVeigh. But in the case of Oswald, they created this image that he was a member of the Fair Play for Cuba committee, and they staged an incident where he got in a fight and he got arrested. So his name was in the paper and associated with the Fair Play for Cuba committee. The Fair Play for Cuba committee was a left-wing organization that opposed U.S. interference in Cuba and the Bay of Pigs and the U.S. invasion of Cuba, and said that the Cubans had a right to their own revolution. But that was just the cover. Oswald actually worked as a clandestine agent to infiltrate the Fair Play for Cuba committee as a government agent and as a kind of provocateur, which the government does in both left and right wing groups. We've seen this more recently with January 6th, where there are all these government provocateurs and they have their own agenda. So he was not actually a leftist. That was his cover. And now we have more and more corroboration that he was a CIA asset. And then he worked for this guy was Guy Bannister, with the guy's name. He was an FBI agent, and he was involved in the penetration of left-wing groups, the COINTELPRO, like the Fair Play for Cuba, and Oswald worked with him and others in that milieu in New Orleans. And Oswald, his background with that, he venerated, like when he was a kid, he watched the show I Was a Spy for the FBI. Like, he always wanted to be a spy. And if you look into his background, it makes sense. He always wanted to be a spy. He venerated John Wayne, but he actually also venerated Kennedy. Like, there was no motive for him. This claim of this lone deranged gunman makes no sense, because there evidence that Oswald loved Kennedy. So why would he kill him? But the cover story was that he was this leftist, and it was the left. You know, as part of the Cold War atmosphere, like the CIA and Johnson, to deflect attention from their corruption, they created this Cold War hysteria, and they wanted to blame the leftists, as they always do. You know, blame them for this ghastly assassination, and blame the Russians and blame the Cubans. But it was all disinformation. And Garrison was one who was investigating this. He was investigating Oswald's, ties to Guy Bannister, these right-wing milieu and their connection to the intelligence services. And he prosecuted Clay Shaw, who was a player in this network and had some involvement in the overall conspiracy, although that case against Shaw wasn't successful. And then Garrison was smeared by journalists like Hugh Ainsworth and demonized. But then Oliver Stone kind of rehabilitated his image in his film JFK. And I think today, Garrison may widely be viewed as a national hero. And actually, I watched this summer, I was at a whistleblower conference, and there was a documentary about William Pepper, who's another lawyer who represented the King family, and he uncovered the conspiracy behind the King, the FBI's involvement, and the central role played by Clyde Tolson, Hoover's number 2 man. But he's also been smeared in the media, and even because William Pepper died last year, and the New York Times, and I did an article about this, the New York Times had a disgraceful obituary when they written by Clay Risen, the son of James Risen, a known national security reporter, and he attacked William Pepper, this conspiracy theorist, and said, "Oh, he's known to appear at conspiracy conferences and 9/11 truth conferences, and is it's just really an attack smear piece that failed to acknowledge the incredible research Pepper had done and incredible lawyering. And this documentary said that he considered there to be three great lawyers in American history, the three greatest. We can argue. I mean, there's figures like Clarence Darrow, who stood up for civil liberties, but he said, Abraham Lincoln, Jim Garrison, and William Pepper should be regarded as the greatest lawyers in American history, and really our national heroes. And I think that is true. Kids should learn in the future about Jim Garrison and William Pepper, and I think they're great role models for current and future generations, how they really did their job as lawyers to really try and get at the truth and confront these powerful people and powerful conspiracies, and how they were attacked. And people could learn not to go along with these smears against people who are honorable investigators.
What about, let me ask you this. There was a lot of chicanery around the what were the name of the hearings for the whatchamacallit that you just mentioned that Jackie Kennedy was not happy with?
Yeah, the Warren Commission.
The Warren Commission, right?
Set that up, and he put, Hoover organized it. Hoover was in on the conspiracy. Hoover was very, very close with Lyndon Johnson. They were neighbors in Washington, and Hoover hated the Kennedys. Some of it was just personal animus, and also I think Kennedy was going to make Hoover retire. So Hoover was in on the plot and the cover-up, and he helped put together the commission. And then they appointed Allen Dulles, who had been the CIA director, who hated Kennedy because of the Bay of Pigs operation and felt Kennedy had thrown him under the bus. So Dulles, Hoover, and Johnson were key to this cover-up. And the Warren Commission was a fraud. Yeah. They cherry-picked evidence to suit the preordained conclusion that Oswald was the killer, and they didn't pursue real investigation. And actually, they made like a lengthy report, to make it look like it was credible. It's like a 900-page report, but like a lot of it is just like it goes back. It's just, some of it is just nonsense, and some of it is just like going back and forth on, or bring out all this minutia to obfuscate that they weren't carrying out a real investigation. And sometimes academics will do this. They use this verbose rhetoric. It makes it seem profound, and it's just hot air. The whole thing was hot air. And there are a number of prominent members of that commission at the time who privately said it was a fraud. And a key figure was Hale Boggs. And he was appointed, I think, because he was a Democratic Party congressman from the state of Louisiana. And I think Lady Bird was close with his wife. So Johnson thought he'd be a loyalist. But after he participated in this commission, actually, it was Hale Boggs that tipped off Jim Garrison, because Hale Boggs was Louisiana congressman. He was on the Warren Commission. He didn't say anything publicly, but privately, he tipped off Jim Garrison that something was wrong about that investigation. And then subsequently, he denounced Hoover on the floor of Congress for running a Gestapo. And then he died in a suspicious plane crash. And the Discovery Channel is doing a story about that, and they interviewed me. So I can inform listeners when that is coming out, because I went down to Hollywood earlier this year to be interviewed, because that was a very suspicious plane crash that looks like there was foul play. And he was the source, Boggs, to tip off Jim Garrison. And he knew the truth, that the Warren Commission was a sham. And now we have more evidence that Jackie Kennedy understood that John Connally, who was in the limo, understood that. And there are some others on that commission who hinted that, in later years, or after they died, records came to light that they didn't think it was impartial in any way.
Yeah. What was suspicious about what was suspicious about that plane crash?
The Hale Boggs.
Yeah.
there are a lot of suspicious things about it. I think there was evidence that a bomb was planted, and a mafia figure admitted that he planted a bomb, and then he had connection with intelligence agencies.
Yeah, but it's amazing. When I started researching, because I taught organized crime, and one of the first things I found out, I recall this, was during World War II on the waterfront in New York, there was talk of Nazi spies, and the Navy intelligence says, "All right, we're going to deal with the Longshoremen's Union to find them out." And they said, "Who's the guy?" And they said, "Well, the guy that could help you is in jail. It's Lucky Luciano." So the naval intelligence went and got Lucky Luciano out of jail and said, "All right, can you help us deal with this?" And they would give names and just say, "Here's this guy's a Nazi spy," and the guy would end up, floating in the harbor, whatever the case may be. But in hindsight, it's believed that, like, if the person was considered to be a leftist or a possible communist or anti-war or something like that, they give the name to the mafia and say, "Hey, he's it started off like, hey, we're going to give the names of potential," because a big ship was burned down. And it was believed, they argued that it was the Nazis that burnt this ship. They took like a passenger liner and they were going to change it into a troop carrier to take troops overseas, and it burned down. The intelligence then says, "Well, we got to have some help on stopping these German spies who are burning down our ships." And it started, supposedly, they'll give them a name of a potential German spy, and the guy ends up floating in the harbor. And then it's, how the intelligence does. You're anti-war, you're maybe a leftist, you're something they don't like, somebody they feel is the problem. Now it just became a way of exterminating people who worked on the docks or who were around the docks, or in some instances, just some guy in New York City who they wanted dead. They give him name to the mafia, they rub him out, nobody's the wiser. Are you familiar with that? And I'll put it like this. That's when I started the whole Whitey Bulger stuff. That's when I started learning, holy crap, the United States, the FBI, and our intelligence agencies are inextricably linked to organized crime.
Yeah, and there's a very good book by Doug Valentine, and he doesn't cover all aspects, but it's called "CIA as Organized Crime." And yeah, it's been documented how they used Lucky Luciano to, I guess during World War II, he was an asset of the intelligence agencies. And that's how some of it may have started. And they used them in Europe. There was a strong alliance between the CIA and even the AFL-CIO to use the mafia to root out leftists in the labor unions, because they and to break communist strikes, because they were trying to support the center left. They weren't totally, because a lot of the CIA were at that time were like center left. So they supported labor unions, but they wanted to drive out the communists. They wanted anti-communist unions, and they were trying to bring in these center left governments in Europe. So they used the mafia to do some of the dirty work. And then, they used the mafia to control the drug trade, like in Indochina and the Corsica. So, that goes back to the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Yeah, there's a book by Alfred McCoy, a classic book, The Politics of Heroin, CIA Complicity in the Global Drug Trade. And it looks at the CIA's alliance with mafia networks going back to that era, World War II, and through the Indochina wars. And then you see that in the Cuba, the Church Committee revealed how the CIA was hiring the mafia to try and kill Castro and to carry out these dirty operations in Cuba and South America. And again, control of the drug traffic was very crucial. So a lot of that is pretty actually well documented historically. And then obviously they continue to use some of the same methods. I was looking into the Operation Timber Sycamore in Syria, and they were smuggling arms through Eastern European countries. The CIA, David Petraeus was the coordinator of that, was the CIA director. And the CIA was in league with mafia elements throughout Eastern Europe to get those arms. And a member of the mafia actually took control of the government of Bulgaria. And Obama forged very, very tight relations with him. That was not a barrier to close U.S. government relations with that regime, even though it was run by a mafia lord. And they were using Bulgaria to procure weapons for this pipeline to these Syrian jihadist terrorists who are now committing genocidal acts in Syria. It was like similar to Iran-Contra. The mafia was all over that in getting arms to the Nicaraguan Contra terrorists. There's all kind of illegal activity associated with that. So there's a long pattern in different ways they use the mafia, whether it's destroying unions and roughing up the leftists, or whether it's to procure arms and drugs.
Well, one of the things that was interesting in the textbooks, what I was supposed to teach about, the textbooks that I could find, in the book that I find, when they talked about Lucky Luciano, and he, the intelligence community got him out of jail and said, okay, but allegedly they made a deal with him that after the war was over, he was going to have to move back to Sicily or whatever, to Italy, right? And they said, but he broke the deal and he set up a residence and an operation in Cuba. But for some reason, the CIA didn't hold him to that. Instead, they allowed him to do that. And I'm like, no, they didn't allow him. He didn't break the deal. When they got finished working with him, and everybody knows this, and I'd say this to my student, Havana was a hotbed. That was where the CIA and the mob, really forged their ties and did their dirty work and made a lot of crooked money. And there is little doubt in my mind that, no, he didn't break the deal. That may have been publicly, or that may have been the, exoteric, the cover story. But no doubt they moved him into Cuba to continue operation working with him. That's the only thing that makes sense, Jeremy. What do you think?
This is Lansky?
This is
Oswald.
Lucky Luciano. Lucky Luciano. Yes. There was supposed to be a deal after they finished working with him in World War II. He was supposed to move back to Sicily, to Italy, and never come back to the Americas again. Hey, he moved over to Cuba, to Havana, and started operating there, in violation supposedly of their deal. I'm like, that wasn't a violation of their deal. That was part of the move. Once he became an operative for intelligence, he remained an operative for intelligence.
Yeah, usually once in the CIA, always in the CIA. And yeah, that CIA mafia nexus, I think you're right about that, was very key in Cuba. It was kind of crystallized in Cuba. And there were mutual interests there because the Batista dictatorship had allowed the mafia in, turned Havana into a mafia playground, and it was good for U.S. business. I mean, we should also look at the nexus of big business, and like United Fruit Company, for instance, in Cuba and Guatemala, and they often employ the mafia to break strikes or keep the workers in check, do the dirty work at the company. So I think we have to add them. They're part of this nexus. It's the mafia, it's the multinational corporations, and the CIA doing the dirty work. And Batista was their boy because he gave choice concessions to the United Fruit Company and didn't allow them they didn't have to pay much tax. They could just pay off because they're so corrupt. They like corrupt governments because they can just easily pay them off. And then and he allowed the mafia to operate freely. And then Castro put their playground was ended. Their utopia was ended by the Castro revolution. So obviously they had it in for him, and he now nationalized industry. He went much further. I mean, they took out Arbenz in Guatemala when he just put in some moderate land reform and offered compensation for fallow land. But Castro went full to the hilt, nationalizing government takeover and kicked the mafia out. So they went after him full hilt. And yeah, the mafia was the key as far as the Operation Mongoose and these assassination plots. There were, I think, dozens of them using the mafia, and that came to light in the Church Committee hearing.
Well, one of the things I had somebody say to me, if you want to understand the U.S. empire, go to the islands, check out their protectorates and colonies, right? Okay. So I did some looking into the Virgin Islands. So maybe this specifically because, and I went to the Virgin Islands and, went to St. John. We're going around the island, and then my guy points, he says, see that lump of right there that you can see out there? You're sitting here, here's the U.S. Virgin Islands, here's the British Virgin Islands. I could have took a kayak to the, and rowed across that. It wouldn't have been far, but it wasn't that far. You could do it, right? I'm sitting there and he's like, yep. And that's the Virgin Islands, and we're here in the U.S. And he's like, you see that island you're looking at right out there? I said, yeah. He said, that's Epstein Island. And I'm like, isn't it interesting? MI6 is here, CIA is here, and I'm looking at Epstein Island. I don't think that's an accident, right? Mm-hmm. And the one thing, if you go right now and you research government in the Virgin Islands, if you go there and you talk to the people in the Virgin Islands and what can you tell me about their government? They'll say it's extremely corrupt. The Virgin Islands is known for extremely corrupt governments, right? But when you go to any island, colony, or protectorate that the U.S. has, you'll find the same thing: extreme corruption. And so I come to realize this: the U.S. and British, when they have these colonies and islands, that's why, look, a lot of these islands where they hide money, you know what I mean? Where they where they have all the shell companies and hide money. When you look at them, they're former British colonial islands that they keep. They control the government so they can do all of their dirty work there, and MI6 can hide their money, and big billionaires can hide their money. But I went to Virgin Islands and I realized, wow, this is the CIA and MI6 rich people's playground. You go to St. John's and you wander around there, there's nothing but like millionaires and billionaires everywhere. The most beautiful beaches on the world, Coral Beach, etc., right? You go down to Coral Beach and wander around, ain't nobody there. You could take a nap. Nobody, there's so few people that live on the island. It's a really rich person's playground that you can go there and wander around yourself if you want to. But you can't even get there. They don't have an airstrip. The only way to get there is to go to St. John's. Go to, what is the main one? Whatever the main one is, I forgot. And take the island over. So, take a boat over. That's the only way to get there. So I'm like, it seems to me, in the same way that they used Cuba for their mafia and CIA playground, the Virgin Islands has to be that, because that's where the MI6 is there, CIA is there, and in fact, Epstein Island's right there, that they're using these colonies for all of their international dirt. What do you think, Jeremy?
Yeah, I think that's good. And that would be a good book for somebody to write, to really just flesh that out and provide some of the details so we could better understand how that works and how that history plays out. But I think you're certainly onto something there.
If I do a search right now,
I don't know that much about the Virgin Island or the native population or government, but it makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
Here we go. St. Thomas. That's it. Let me give you an example. Just out of the blue, if we just search it, right? Watch this. Op-ed, State of the Territory, the cost of corruption, how the Virgin Islands is being robbed in plain sight, right? Corruption erodes trust in governments, right? And you go into it, government officers. So if you read this, right, you find a symptom of larger systemic failure. To me, it's not an accident that the place that they chose to base the Epstein Island, or the Epstein operation out of, number one, you can literally damn near swim from the U.S. to the Brits, right? You can just about almost swim. You can probably, some people could easily, actually, you could swim. You can stand there and look at it. If you're a really good swimmer, maybe a couple miles. I couldn't swim it, but really good swimmer could swim. They put that all there for a reason, which also tells me that there is an entire web of corruption. If you're going to do that with the Virgin Islands, and as I said, when you go to St. John, it's a playground for the filthy rich. They got one hotel there, and I forgot which one it is, but it's like $3,000 a night or something crazy in a lot of these rooms. It's a playground for the rich. Sounds to me like it's a web of corruption and international and Mossad. I'm sure they're there, but international. Oh, by the way, let me add this. Here's something interesting. When you go to Virgin, let's say you go to St. John's, right? You go down. Let's say you go down to the shopping area. You've never seen so many jewelry shops in your life. Jewelry lined up and down the street. You see Rolex, you see the most expensive watches, any kind of jewelry all over the island, everywhere. And what I was told was that there's so much of that, so much that they get really good prices, and people, literally rich people, fly in and they'll buy $250,000, $300,000 worth of jewelry at a time because you can get it so much cheaper there, and which tells me there's massive corruption going on there, and criminality and all kind of stuff like that. And I knew this from studying. Jewelry is a way people launder money. That's a money laundering. That's a way of, buying expensive things, whether it's and jewelry is an easy way to launder dirty money. You know what I mean? And when you buy it there, I mean, you just buy cash. You come in, you buy $100,000 worth of jewelry cash, and you leave. You sell that, you do whatever. You've just laundered $100,000. And if it was free drug money, who cares? Mm-hmm. So that's what that direction we're going. All right. So let's also go to. We've been talking about JFK. Did we talk about the UK?
Ukraine?
Yeah.
Not yet. No.
All right. Let's get to that. Let's get in so much important stuff, I get mixed up. Stepan Bandera's sinister MI6 alliance exposed. Well, some things never changed. So this is a great article at covertactionmagazine.com. And what they get into is the infamous Stepan Bandera, the Nazi collaborator, Nazi organizer in Ukraine, that is like the father of their nationalist fascist movement in Ukraine, was a big CIA, MI6 operative. And may I say this? I'm going to add this before I get to you. And that is, I'm convinced even now that Zelensky is not, everybody's like, he was Biden's boy. He's MI6 boy. Because for this reason, number one, MI6, I think, led this operation, not the U.S. I think the MI6 was, I've often said this about the U.S. when it comes to foreign policy, that the Brits feel like this. We got the brains, you got the brawn. We'll do all the smarts. We know how to do imperialism, and you guys got the muscle, and we'll do it. Number one, who was it that went and killed the Istanbul Agreement? It was Bojo. That was the UK. Who was it that what's his name, that when Zelensky got his feelings hurt in the White House, where did he run to? London. Who put everything together? London. He's an MI6 co-op, and who is supporting him no matter what. Now that the Americans have abandoned him, clearly he ain't their guy. London will not abandon him no matter what. What happens when Trump says, hey, let's make a deal let's talk in Riyadh tomorrow? Somebody did targeting for the Ukrainians so they could fire 300 drones and missiles the night before. Well, who could do the targeting? They couldn't themselves. It was MI6. That MI6 is the brains, hate to put it this way, behind the Ukraine conflict, number one. And your article about Stepan Bandera being an MI6 op supports that. Let's talk about that.
Okay, yeah, and the article by Kit Clarenberg, he's a great investigative journalist. Well, and there was also a documentary by Scott Ritter that people could consult that fleshes out this argument that Zelensky is indeed an MI6 agent. And he shows how, I think the documentary starts by noting that when Zelensky visited UK, he went right to the head of MI6. He didn't actually go see the head of state in the UK. And so that's very suspicious, because normally he would not interact with the head of MI6, let alone go there as his first visit, the first person he visits. So, and then, Ritter lays out how Zelensky had betrayed his own country in different ways, and goes into his drawing off some of the key points you just made. He goes in further detail about what you're saying. So, and this article, looks historically at the end of the Cold War, how Britain really drove this hardline anti-Russia policy. And Winston Churchill was really an ardent Russophobe. And I mean, you can go back several hundred years. The British Empire repeatedly invoked the Russian bogeyman to justify a lot of its imperialistic foreign policies, including conquest of India and Afghanistan. They would constantly invoke the Russian threat. I mean, we don't have this only in our culture, where we're constantly bombarded with this mythic Russian threat, and we have this overinflated rhetoric, about the Russians are coming. I mean, that's been prevalent in Europe and in British society for hundreds of years now. And that's the way they can justify a lot of their imperialistic foreign policies. So history kind of just continues. And, after World War II, there was, I mean, that was a period where the Russian threat was greatly embellished because, I mean, the Nazis had killed between 20 to 26 million Russians had been killed during World War II in their heroic resistance to the Nazis, and much of the country's infrastructure was destroyed. So there was no way that they were going to start another world war or that they were going to adopt any confrontational policy toward European countries or toward the United States. And I think this article goes into the Gellin network. The CIA and MI6 also recruited Nazi spy chief Reinhard Gellin, and in part for his own survival, because he was a Nazi war criminal, but he was recruited because he had vast knowledge of the Soviet, the Soviet Union and Soviet intelligence networks. So they recruited him, but he played up the Cold War threat from the Soviet Union because that made him seem more valuable and that they needed him. And he helped promote this, this paranoid fantasy that the Russians were coming. And, Churchill was also doing that. I mean, he was a gung-ho imperialist and Russophobe and gung-ho supporter of the Cold War. And the U.S. originally had Roosevelt, and Henry Wallace was Roosevelt's vice president, and he was slated to succeed Roosevelt in 44. When Roosevelt was getting sick, he got renominated for the presidency, but it was clear he wouldn't live out his term. But the Democratic Party power brokers orchestrated a coup against Wallace because he was just promoting a realistic view of the Russians and a peaceful approach. But they had to get rid of him, and they brought in Harry Truman, who worked better with Churchill in advancing this aggressive, militaristic, anti-Soviet Cold War policy that ultimately led to the Vietnam War. But in Ukraine, they were allied with the far-right elements who had collaborated with Nazi Germany, Bandera and his associates, and that's who MI6 and CIA worked for. And I mean, there's a stark continuity today because the people that the CIA and MI6 work for around the Zelensky regime are also far-right, fascist-leaning Banderites who openly celebrate Stepan Bandera. And I think it was, these leaders that the U.S. brought in, starting with Viktor Yushchenko after the 2005 color revolution, backed by the CIA and NED, they rehabilitated Stepan Bandera because he had been, considered a Nazi criminal. But then when Yushchenko came in, they rehabilitated his image, and all these far-right Banderites became more and more influential in the post-Maidan government. And that's who the CIA has worked with, an SBU, because CIA is all over Ukraine since the Maidan coup, and they're working with these far-right fascistic Banderites, and they've done the heavy lifting in the fight against the Russians. But of course, a lot of them have been killed now.
What's interesting is this. Okay, so the idea being that the kind of the intellectual foundation, if I were to use that word, behind this resurgence of the Banderites and supporting Zelensky and the Banderites, etc., is MI6, is London. Here's what's interesting. because here's what I think: as Zelensky's star has started to fade, and when MI6 could see, wow, his stars at some point is going to fade. We need a backup. Who'd they go get? They made Valery Zaluzny the ambassador to England and brought him to England. What are you doing now? You're starting to set him up to be the next MI6 puppet when London goes, right? And now what do we hear? Now, what do we know about Zelensky? The guy has a picture of Bandera in his office. He's a diehard Banderite. He's rumored to be very close to the ultra-nationalists. No, he's not close to the ultra-nationalists. He's one of the ultra-nationalist leaders. I saw a picture of him with a bracelet on that had a swastika on it. This guy is a Nazi. He's an old school Nazi. He's not a neo-Nazi. Nothing new about him. So what do the Brits do? They nab Zelensky, and I think they cooked up a story. Well, Zelensky's pissed at Zelensky. He's angry at him, so he made him step down and made him the ambassador to England, and off he went to London. I don't think there was an argument. I think that was the plan that MI6 decided, all right, we need Zelensky in London. We need to work with him, set him up, prep him maybe to be the next guy. And if there's another government, he'll be our guy. And that's all it is. So Zelensky's puppet A and Zelensky is being groomed in London to be puppet B. What do you think?
That would make a lot of sense. Yeah, we had there's an article, I think that'll be published in Covert Action magazine next week by a Russian who was just analyzing who might succeed Zelensky, because his stock has fallen, and I think the coup de grace with that Trump meeting, where just the aura about him was totally punctured, and I think Ukrainians have turned against him. So who's going to be next? And Zelensky is discussed in this article, and that fits the mold. Yeah, and I mean the British and American claim to be supporting democracy, but they end up empowering and aligning with the most far right fascistic elements, because those are the most those serve their interests, because they're the ardent Russophobes, and they support capitalism. The same time that allows for Western companies to move in, which is another agenda at play. But I think you have a good assessment there. And he was discussed in this article, right at the center of a key probable successor to Zelensky. I mean, I don't know if they're going to have elections. They kept delaying the election. There were supposed to be elections a while back now. So I don't know what's going to happen with that, but your point is good that they brought him to England and they made sure to cultivate him, and they always do this. In a lot of the cases, if you look historically, the U.S. would support dictators in a lot of the country, like say Marcos in Philippines or Mobutu in Congo, and then when the writing was on the wall, in those cases it took 20, 30 years. But when the public had turned totally against them and they'd become international embarrassments, or in Mobutu's case, he got cancer, so it was known he wouldn't live that much longer, they start to plan for the future. In the Philippines, they had supported Marcos, but then they supported and co-opted the opposition movement, which is what they often do. They'll co-opt the opposition movements and recruit somebody. In this case, I think, this guy was already far right and pro-West. They didn't have to change his worldview in any way, but they see him as somebody who'll be the next Zelensky.
How about this Ukrainian election? Who could replace Zelensky? Gee, I wonder who might. Blah, blah, blah. Valery Zelensky.
Yeah,
abroad.
I was just going to add the point that they banned all the socialists and left-wing parties, and that's who they don't want. The parties that want to make an alliance and peace with the Russians and adopt more left-wing economic program that would undercut the power of Western and U.S. multinational corporations and Wall Street connected firms. So they'll do everything to muscle out and eliminate those groups And that's why they support the far right, who will probably keep the ban of Zelensky, would continue the policy of banning the leftist parties. And yeah,
The
Poroshenko is another contender, and he's also far right and corrupt.
Look at this. The Economist, nothing MI6 related there, certainly, suggests that Zelensky would lose a future election to Zelensky by 30 to 65%. Wow. Zelensky, a British intelligence related operation, also falsified as The Economist magazine, suggests that Zelensky would win in a blowout. Well, you know how they know that? Because they would orchestrate that he won in the blowout. So to me, it's obvious. Yeah, it's an MI6 game, and old Zelensky is the next puppet that they're planning, that they're grooming. You know, that's just so clear and obvious to me. And so let's get back to this, more about old Bandera. Now, I understand to some extent the CIA had their fascist Nazi puppets, and MI6 had their fascist Nazi puppets, and at times they had issues where the two didn't get along in Ukraine.
Yeah, that could happen sometime. There's always the rivalry, goes back to the American Revolution. I mean, sometimes the U.S. and Britain work well together and have the same interests and agenda, but other time there may be friction and competition. And in Ukraine, I forget who he goes into in that article. There was a guy.
You got von Mind, maybe? Gerhard von Mind, he was one of them.
There's another guy, I can't remember. I think
he
ended up being close to Bush, George H.W. Bush. There's a guy.
Wow.
He's in that article. I forget his name now. But he ended up being a supporter of George H.W. Bush. I think he ended up coming to the United States since, in the Cold War, the rollback of the CIA had an Operation Rollback. And there's a good book by Peter Gross that was based on interviews. It was written in the 90s after the fall of the Soviet Union. Some of these old CIA agents who were old by then were willing to talk about what they had done in the 1940s. So they kind of spilled the beans to this New York Times reporter. It was a pretty mainstream, reporter, but the book, it's called Operation Rollback. I used to assign it to students because I taught a course on the history of the CIA, and we looked at those rollback operations in Eastern Europe where they would run these exiles in Ukraine and other Eastern European countries like Albania and Romania. And a lot of time they were fascists or Nazi collaborators. And the KGB developed very effective intelligence networks. So a lot of them got killed, and they didn't have a huge base of popular support within Ukraine at that time or other Eastern European countries. So they were rooted out pretty quickly. And then one of the leaders of that movement in Ukraine, again, I'd have to remember his name, but he ended up in exile in the United States, and he supported George H.W. Bush. There was some kind of relationship between them, but I don't remember all the details off the top of my head.
Well, the Bush family, were long connected to Nazis. In fact, Prescott Bush ran a bank. Him and the guy's name, I forgot it, was it Harrigan or whatever? The Democrat, they ran a bank that financed the Nazis all the way up until 1943. During the war, they were still financing the Nazis, and FDR ended up having to shut the bank down. But they were so powerful, he had to allow them to keep their money.
Yeah.
So, it's amazing when you look at the connection between the U.S. and the Nazis, even during World War II, even while we were fighting it. And then immediately,
the Brown Brothers Harriman, because Bush was involved with that bank. And Averell Harriman was a key figure in U.S. foreign policy for many years and was the mentor of Joe Biden in the Senate. Biden discusses that in his own memoir. And Harriman helped found that investment bank. And they had leading Nazi financiers of their clients. And it worked in collaboration with some of Prescott Bush's other companies, and I think some other members of the Bush family. George Herbert Walker, and some related by marriage. And yeah, and this is documented. There's a number of books detailing this. But it's the same. They commit, like we were saying earlier with the Kennedy assassination, because these guys actually committed treason. There's evidence like that Prescott Bush even continued to trade with Nazis and these banking firms, even after the U.S. went to war with Nazi Germany, and you had the passage of the Enemy Trading Act, which they may have violated. There's pretty strong evidence they violated that. And there was investigation that were being started in the State Department. And that's when they started accusing and attacking people of being communist agents in the State Department. And it was to deflect attention from these investigations. They were the real traitors because they attacked Alger Hiss, some very prominent people in the State Department. But really, the real traitors were them. And this kind of blocked these investigations because it turned attention on the alleged communist threat and Soviet threat. And these investigations lost momentum, and the target became the alleged presence of Soviet agents in the American government, which was actually very, very limited. So they did the same trick with the Kennedy assassination. Instead of a real investigation into these corrupt elements in Texas and the CIA who orchestrated a coup against Kennedy, they blamed Oswald and made him out to be an agent of a foreign power, Russia, Soviet Union again, and Cuba, and it ratcheted up this Cold War sentiment. So that's a trick of corrupt government leaders, is to play up a foreign threat and deflect attention or investigation into their own corruption. And that's one thing we can learn from history, and not fall for the same thing over and over again, and buy into this mythical narrative they advance.
Well, one of the things that's interesting is if you look at George Bush, the German descent, look who he surrounded himself with: Karl Rove, whose grandfather was a Nazi, Karl Rumsfeld. In fact, it is well known that Colin Powell used to refer to Rumsfeld and his group as those Nazis over at the Pentagon. So the Bush people brought back in the very Nazis. And let me bring something else in. Let me do this. A lot of people might not know this.
Those kind of evil people, they're good at maneuvering themselves into positions of power. We seem to always be stuck with the worst of the worst as our leaders.
Here's something that a lot of people may not know. Built in 1968, just so you'll understand. It's sitting there right now. You can go actually see it if you get on the base. Coronado swastika building, right? Coronado, this is the building right here. Look at that. That is an actual swastika. And where is it? It's on the naval base. When one thinks of Coronado, sandy beaches, cookie cut houses, and the Hotel Del, they come to mind. One would most likely not think about a swastika-shaped buildings on the naval base. This is it. Now tell me how accidentally somebody could build that building on a Navy base in 1968 and have no clue what it was supposed to be. There you go. Look at that. That was built in 1968. Now, if you look at it, what happens is they did a research, because the Navy said, oh, it was an accident and we didn't even realize it, and who knew about the shape. So there was some research done, and they said, okay, let's get the original documents that were signed off on, right? So they found the original plans. Okay, the Navy had no idea that building was shaped like a swastika, right? Here's the original plans from 1968. There you go. Location of new building. That's the original plans, but according to the Navy, they had no idea that it was going to end up looking like a swastika. Completely befuddled by the fact that that building's sitting there right now. That's it.
That's unbelievable.
Yeah, that's right now. That's the U.S. That's our building. There it is. Your vicinity map. There's this was 1967, I believe. The names that it was signed off on. The architect. There we go. William T. Hendrick. blah, blah, blah. Oh, Naval Amphibious Base, Coronado, San Diego, construction of barracks, Southwest Division. There's everything signed off. 11/28/67. Well, gee, I can't understand why somebody would look at that and, how anybody could suspect that that would end up looking like a swastika. Totally baffling and befuddling to me. So anybody that thinks that there was not a severe Nazi influence, keep in mind, 1968, right? That's 23 years after 23 years. If there were people who fought in World War II who were 18, 19, let's say 20 years old when it ended, they were only 45. They died fighting the Nazis. Well, bad news for them. They came home and the Nazis were there. So that was a point made, but it sits there to this day.
Jeez.
It's sitting right there. Did you know that was there?
I didn't know about that. I think I knew about that from you. You brought it up once before, but other than that, no.
Yeah, people can look it up. So if you live in San Diego, you got a Nazi building right there. And these things are important to discuss. Jeremy Kuzmarov, once again, let me show everybody the important place they need to go for all of their information, and that is covertactionmagazine.com. I understand. Are you guys doing some kind of there's the donate button. We got to make sure everybody understands. See, they got their spring fundraiser going on. Blow the whistle on U.S. imperialism, and plutocrats worldwide contribute to Covert Actions Magazine Spring 2025 fundraiser. There you go, right there. You can send a check. There's their address, or you can certainly click the donate button, and there's lots of ways, PayPal and all that kind of stuff. So make sure you do everything you can to help the good work that they're doing. And you guys really somebody needs to do an article on the old Coronado Nazi building. That would
be a great article. We welcome you writing an article or any of our listeners.
That's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah,
it's crazy. It was an accident. And you look at the original paperwork and most of the sheet is white and there's like a big black swastika in the middle. And they're like, and if you research it, when it was brought to their attention, they're like, hey, that's a swastika. They're like, okay, we'll build some buildings around it so it doesn't quite look like a swastika anymore. They built the buildings around it. And of course, it looked exactly like a swastika. And they never even got into this. Well, perhaps maybe build buildings around it. Perhaps maybe we shouldn't have a swastika on American soil. Actually, sadly, we really should. What was it around Nixon? Haldeman, Ehrlichman, all those people, they called them the Berlin Front. There's a long history here of this kind of crap. Well, thanks a lot, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Certainly appreciate it. I really enjoy talking to you. And every week, if all of my listeners that are watching all these other shows really knew, this would be an important show for them to listen to. But we're going to keep doing it every Friday morning, and I suspect it'll build. Thanks a lot, Jerry Kuzmarov. Anything else people need to know? Oh, you guys are on. You are on where? Where can they find you on X or wherever?
I do have a Substack, Jeremy Kuzmarov at Substack. Yeah, it's too hot for the mainstream, so you can check me out there as well.
All right. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot, everybody. A couple of things. Number one, make sure you share this on all your social media platforms. Follow me on Rockman. Follow me on Rumble. I'm sure the algorithm on YouTube is not going to be pushing this one at the top of your feed by any stretch of the imagination. So you guys got to do the heavy lifting. You got to share this on all your social media platforms. Also, you got to follow me everywhere. And last but not least, if you can afford, whether it's Patreon, PayPal, buy me a coffee. That's always an easy one because it's just like, buy Garland a coffee. How much? 5 beans. It'll say how many. And right under there's a thing that you can click if you want to make that monthly. So that's a good option. Thank you very, very much, everyone. And of course, covertactionmagazine.com, the number one location for you to find out all the devious and diabolical deeds of the intelligence operations. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Thanks a lot, everybody. We're out.
Thank you.